and not taking deputy.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In opening opposition, we have Stanford A.
And patient second period. Whatever you want.
Thank you very much. In closing government, we have NUSA. All right. And last but not least, we have Dartmouth A. Thank you very much. Dartmouth A?
Oh, sorry. Mine first.
Thank you very much. Cool. Couple of ground rules. If you are loud, we will try to throw you out. It's going to be difficult, but please don't be loud. We're not going to be able to hear, especially because you're behind the judges. Secondly, if you like the team, please do not clap during their speeches because we will not be able to hear and you're actually making it worse for them rather than good for them. Clap afterwards. This is all fine. And then, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Honorable Prime Minister.
Yeah. Just in terms of timekeeping, is that audible to speakers?
Yeah, but you should time yourself at this stage.
Yes.
As well.
Hopefully.
We can see the comments on the screen as well. Screen, be nice. Like and subscribe to Luigi. Thank you.
Ireland faced the vulture fund in the form of BlackRock that essentially tried to get them to pick up all the amount of their debt and didn't necessarily work, but also beyond that, it wasn't even necessarily needed because Ireland ended up recovering economically anyway. That's our case. It's basically fucks over countries that otherwise would have had a path to recovery from the debt crisis they had in the very first place. I think our model is very clear. We're simply banning vulture funds from having the capacity to sue any of these governments in any court in the world. We have the fiat to do that. I think it's relatively clear. I think on our side of the house, we're going to prove that vulture funds are less likely, and I think that probably the alternative on our side of the house is that you get the country getting bailed out or when it defaults, or it just exogenously recovers because it's able to continue servicing its debt after the crisis in has abated. Those are the likely alternatives. I want to first be clear about why vulture funds often win these litigations, but on the comparative would cease to exist. They win these litigations for 5 reasons. First of all, these litigation processes often only look at the legal aspects of the case. So they ignore the underlying macroeconomic climate because they don't necessarily focus on that. They focus on the term of the agreement of the debt, and so we're trying to honor on that. Secondly, laws are often written by creditor states, i.e. rich ones like the US and the UK, for example, so they favour repayment at all costs, and so when you sue on that basis, you tend to win on that basis. Third of all, vulture funds themselves, which often tend to be headquartered in the United States, like BlackRock, etc., have great lawyers, the best access, they have all their money invested in this process in order to win. Fourth of all, I think the kind of people who end up in these courts are often judges who tend to be retired and have very punitive ideas about what developing countries ought to do and tend to believe they mismanage things. Fifth of all, I think that even if the developing country, when the defaulting country is dragged into court, they often have a tendency to settle because they don't want to pay in an open-ended litigation that has almost infinite costs, given the cost of lawyers themselves are extraordinarily expensive, and so they settle and accept what the vulture fund wants. I want to be clear then about why vulture funds stop existing, or far more on our side of the house. I'm genuinely not sure what other mechanism they have in order to gain this money back if they are this vulture fund buying up this debt. But also I would know that insofar as this is the most viable mechanism that these vulture funds have used in order to extract any sort of return, that return is far more uncertain on our side of the house, given they are cut off from this mechanism, and so we think they're likely to go bust. They don't have that certain return. Meaning creditors are much more likely to cop the value of their debt and hope the country recovers or hope for an IMF bailout, which we think are likely anyway. Okay, now, on to substantive material. I want to be clear that countries often want to service their debt for obvious reasons because it enables them to have credit worthiness, to gain FDI and so on. So oftentimes when they default, this is often usually a last resort because no country would ever want to find itself in a position that does this. which means oftentimes these defaults are caused by exogenous forces, things like shocks, things like the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID crisis that happened most recently. And oftentimes it's not even headquarters in these countries. It's often contagion. Oftentimes the shock was unforeseen, for example. Yes, of course, sometimes it's the result of government incompetence, but we'll explain why even in those cases, this and the lack of threat of this litigation is probably a positive. But we know in most cases it's exogenous. Yes.
The context this debate operates in are ones in which debt is heavily discounted in price, which suggests that markets do not view an organic recovery as feasible, suggesting that this debate...
Right, okay. So basically, the fact that markets might view organic recovery as infeasible doesn't mean that organic recovery is infeasible. The reason is very simple. It's because obviously, when the market turns against a particular economy, I think that when all of their funds or people who are like really worried about losing value on their debt, for example, when that shifts, oftentimes they move as a herd and so they pivot away from that recovery possibly. So for example, with Greece, underlyingly its fundamentals were probably going to be okay. It was within the EU, it would probably be able to redevelop. But when investors turned against it, that was something that happened en masse. But also, even if the debt is extremely depressed, I think the alternative is things like bailouts, which are better. Okay, so on that side of the house, we think then that you force these countries to pay back a huge amount of money. Because no, it's not just the servicing cost of the debt, it's not just the interest rate, it's the underlying value of the debt itself, which is an extreme cost to these countries. And I think that is absolutely awful, because oftentimes it means that you are forced to abandon important things in fiscal policy. Things like welfare, for example, that pay out to the poorest people who have the highest marginal propensity to consume, and so are most likely to consume during a crisis. Things like education that can redevelop your people who live within your country and so enable a longer-term recovery, for example, as well. So you just are forced to abandon all of those things because you have to pay this extraordinarily high cost, or you're spooked and so you accept a very favourable settlement to these vulture funds. Second of all, I think this oftentimes fucks up politics in these countries as well, for the reason that obviously, when you are forced to pay a vulture fund that often has its headquarters in some United States or whatever it is, I think that's likely to be perceived as something that's absolutely awful. You're likely to lose trust in those countries in general because you view them as massively oppressing you, for example. But third of all, I think that even the process of litigation itself is really bad for these countries. Remember my framing, which is that oftentimes these are during times of crisis. So even just spending any level of time and focus on this is time that is missed that you could be using to redevelop your economy, given that each individual decision in a crisis is absolutely crucial, because each decision has long-term effects and hysteresis effects as well. On our side of the house, I think the first likelihood is, just an exogenous recovery, because, oftentimes the shock abates, for example, COVID ends, and so you're able to recover, and people eventually come in because they view your debt as being distressed and being at a discounted rate, and so investors come in and buy it out anyway because they view the market as underpricing it. Or, second of all, even if it is the case that the alternative on our side of the house is a bailout or something like that, we are happy to cop that. Because at the very least, if it is a bailout, oftentimes those bailouts are done with, by the IMF, done with consideration of the underlying economic circumstances, and so are far less punitive than these kinds of measures. But also, second of all, the IMF is a very good actor in general. It has far better policies than economists post-2008, where it faced some level of backlash, and so we think it's much more likely to put you on a path to recovery. So, in the cases where the debt crisis caused by endogenous fuck-ups that the government has done, we think that insofar as they get bailed out by the IMF, that bailout is conditional on passing these good policies, we still win because you get them put back on the path to recovery. The last thing I want to talk about in this speech is the long-term functioning of the debt market. They might say that you get more people willing to lend to countries in the very first place for the reason that they are guaranteed some level of payout. But oftentimes the benefits of this litigation often go to the vulture fund, and investors still lose out because they are having to sell their debt for a highly, highly discounted rate. So I don't think you get more lenders on their side. But what you might get is countries selling to people who are far less willing to sell to vulture funds in the first place. States, for example, like China, who often impose far more punitive measures in other ways when they buy up the debt, rather than individual capital investors as well. At the end of the day, then, these vulture funds are exploiting the legalistic system, and so we think they have to be stopped. Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now I'm very happy to welcome the leader of the opposition.